Hello, everybody. My name is Jose Alonso. I work for the World Wide Web Foundation as the Director of Digital Citizenship. And today we are in London at the new Speak House on the anniversary of the Panama Papers leak, because we are going to share the pilot version of a tool which we believe can help us tackle the problems revealed 1 year ago today. It's called the OpenOwnership Register. If you see me from time to time reading, or you see me holding a phone, I'm only reading my notes for today, so don't worry. I'm not procrastinating. I'm not looking at, online gaming or that stuff. It's just that I was so lazy today, I forgot to print my notes, so I have them here. I also want to extend our welcome, besides those of you in the room, thanks for coming today, to those people that are watching us online live on our YouTube channel today, and following the webcast for us. First, I want to start with some quick acknowledgements about the project itself. The Web Foundation is only one out of 7 organizations that are partners in this project, and the others are Transparency International, Open Corporates, the V Team, the Open Contracting Partnership, Global Witness, and ONE. All of them have played a role in launching this platform and on the project since the very beginning. Some special thanks from me, and I think from all of us collectively, go to someone that is not in the room with us today and is very much missed, whose name is Chris Traggart from Open Corporates, and who is now on a plane right now and couldn't join us, unfortunately. The reason why it's so important for me is that since I got to meet Chris several years ago, he's been championing this idea of better transparency and accountability, especially for corporates. He has this idea of what is called, what he used to call the Global Beneficial Ownership Register. That is what is becoming the Open Ownership Register today. Several years ago, I heard him talking about this. And to a great extent, sometimes with these ideas and this project, it becomes somehow, a baby of yours. And what we are doing today is we are delivering the baby without the father being in the room, unfortunately. But one of the things that you have to also keep in mind, and Sosha will talk about this later a little bit more, is that for now, it's just a baby. So it's just a pilot project that does some things, but it's not the end product by any means. So you will see that some of the functionality is very limited yet, but we are getting there. I mean, it hasn't learned to walk just yet, but it will in the next months, and we will talk about that later. Last but not least, I want to extend our collective thanks to DFID and the UK government for supporting this project. Thanks to their financial support, we've been able to get to where we are right now, and we are really grateful for their support so far. So I have 3 really strong women with me today, and I'm super glad because we've been talking, with many of my colleagues how we need to increase the presence of women in panels and these projects and these positions, more and more over the years. To my right, I have Maggie Murphy, Senior Global Advocacy Manager at Transparency International, and a beneficial ownership expert who will share her experience and insight on why the register will become an indispensable tool for governments. Next to her, we have May Miller-Tockins, Director of Transparency and Governance at the V Team, who will share her thoughts on the business case for the register and how the private sector is playing a role in improving integrity around beneficial ownership. And then next to her, we have Sosha Estrokowski, who is the project coordinator of Open Ownership, who will demonstrate the platform's pilot version that I mentioned before, and explain its functionality to us. Just before we begin, a few housekeeping points. In addition to the audience here in person, as I said, we are streaming the launch online. So we will be taking questions using Twitter today. So all of you that want to put a question to the panel, please go to the Twitter and tweet using the hashtag OpenOwnership. If you want more information about the project and you want to follow us, the username under which the project tweets is also called OpenOwnership, so it's pretty straightforward. That's about it for today. We will have a small discussion here. We will open up for Q&A. As I said, use the Twitter channel. If you're in the room and you want to get yourself heard, that's also doable. For those of you that will be watching online, you will hear from time to time when we go to Q&A, someone, that you won't see on the screen, asking us the questions that will be read aloud from the Twitter feed. But I will remind you of that later on. And I'd like to start with a question for Maggie. And especially because you had an event today about the Panama Papers 1 year later. So what is the real problem there, and why do you think that it got the attention of the public?
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. So yeah, today is the 1 year anniversary of the Panama Papers leaks. We've seen many leaks over recent years, and each time we've needed those leaks to tell us something that maybe we already knew, and that's that the financial system is just not working. There's a lot of secrecy in the financial system, and we know at Transparency International that where there is secrecy, there will be corruption. And that's our key preoccupation. We want to know why money is able to leave one place, one jurisdiction, and get into another, and why it is that corrupt individuals are able to live lives of luxury using the cash that's been stolen from citizens. And so for us, one of the key issues is, why is it so easy for corrupt individuals to hide their identity behind shell companies and other legal entities, transfer the cash and erase their connection to the money so that they're able to spend it somewhere else? Let me give you a quick example. Back in 2010, Global Witness, one of our partners not here on the panel today, said that they were really concerned about the lack of transparency around some Angolan oil deals. And sure enough, several years later, it was found that 3 senior government officials had set up shell companies, were linked to shell companies that eventually won the government bids. Those shell companies had no experience in dealing with big oil contracts, and yet because those individuals were able to hide their identity, they were awarded the contract without people understanding just how serious that was. So that's just one example of how people are able to hide their identity, use secret shell companies, hide their ownership to that, and cream off money that should be going into a really good company that can make the best use of resources for citizens.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. And do you think that any progress has been made, any significant progress over the last year since the Panama Papers leak? You were discussing this during the whole day. And how do you see the register playing a role on the way forward?
So we have seen some progress over recent years. Probably one of the most significant announcements was back in 2013, so pre-Panama Papers, where the UK government said that they would set up a register that would disclose that information that I was telling you about. The idea that you would disclose the identities of anyone that wanted to set up a company in that jurisdiction. That was a really important landmark decision. And since then, and since the Panama Papers leaks last year, that has gone live. And we suddenly have access to a lot more information about companies that are operating, that are incorporated in the UK. We've also seen a lot more countries understand that this is important. So we had, at the Anti-Corruption Summit last year in May, we had about 8 other governments say, yeah, actually, we're going to do similarly. And we're also seeing an interesting development. So it's not just the UK or France, for example, that think that this is important, but now we're seeing Afghanistan and Ghana and Kenya and Nigeria, so developing countries, also saying we need this information in our territory as well. Many challenges exist. So, for example, here in the UK, we still do not have access to the identities behind the people behind the companies that are in UK overseas territories and crown dependencies. We also don't have access to the information around the beneficial owners of companies that operate in the UK but might not be registered here. So a company that might be based elsewhere might bid for a public contract, they might purchase real estate. We still don't know who are behind those companies. So there's a lot of way to go. We're seeing some interesting movements in terms of the extractive industries transparency initiative, that they have seen the value of having this information, so they collectively in the countries in which they operate are now requiring extractive companies to disclose this information. And we're starting to see little movements in, for example, the UK, again, saying that they will adopt that for companies that want to purchase real estate. So you see extractives, you see real estate, but we still need many, many more countries to get this information out live and public.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I will move to May to talk a little bit more about the private sector, and that is something that we are working towards, in parallel with along with the public sector. And May, what is the case for the private sector to change in light of the Panama Papers?
Well, the reality is that not knowing who's behind companies hurts many companies and investors just as much as it hurts, citizens and the public sector. So we see increasingly that companies, ethical companies, and investors are really waking up to this. And why is this? It's because in their own business dealings, they want to know who they're doing business with. They often face a lot of risk from fraud, from conflicts of interest. So it's in their interest to be able to easily access that information in the many markets in which they operate. We also find that companies that get involved in public procurement want to know whether or not they're in a fair competition based on the fact that they're better at delivering the road infrastructure or the textbooks, or actually if they're in a rigged game that they can't possibly win, but which they're wasting a lot of time on. And we also hear a lot from investors who are increasingly telling us it's hard, we need to know who's behind companies that we're considering investing in. And it's just hard for us to properly assess business models, properly work out if this is a good use for our capital without having access to this information. So I think increasingly we see a lot of business leaders, companies and investors saying, look, we would like access to this information. We can do a certain amount on our own. So some companies are starting to voluntarily disclose their data, including on the OpenOwnership Register. They might start to say to suppliers, we'd like you to do this so that this information is in public and can be checked. But I think they also feel very strongly there's only so far we can go. We can do some things voluntarily, but ultimately we really need more governments to actually implement collection and publication of this information.
That's very interesting. Thanks, Maggie. And what do you think is the role that companies can play?
So I think there's a few things that they can do. I think one of the most powerful things that companies can do is speak out about this issue. So make clear that actually they want access to this information. I think governments very much need to hear from them about that. And we've seen increasingly, the Clearinghouse, the Banking Association in the US starting to speak out, as well as a lot of investors and business leaders. I think they can also take this very seriously in their own operations. So how much disclosure are they requiring from suppliers? You can take that through a number of steps. You could just require they disclose to you. You could make it a contractual obligation, or you can now require or suggest that they actually disclose it publicly and have the benefit of more people checking whether or not that information is actually correct. We've seen some companies start to lower thresholds, say, we actually want to know who owns or controls 10% of a company. 25% we think is not enough to give us reassurance that this company is legit. And we've also had companies start to even disclose their corporate structures in open data. So say that we want to show that we're transparent. And I think in these times when we've seen a real decline in trust in business, I think more and more business is waking up to the fact that transparency is one way to really rebuild trust with consumers, with the public, with their investors.
Thank you very much, May. So I will move over to Socia so she can show us a little bit the platform that we mentioned so we can get a better idea of how the open ownership platform looks and works. And she will give us a short demo.
Delighted to be showing you this tool, which I think has the potential to be a real game changer around corporate transparency and show us links that we might not otherwise see if we were looking at individual national registers or sector-specific registers. But again, like Zima mentioned, this is the baby. It's a minimum viable product, or MVP, which is just text. And I guess my mic wasn't working.
It's the MVP, which is text speak for the minimum necessary to provide useful functionality and get productive feedback. So we're very interested in your feedback. We want this register to work for you. So we're hoping you'll test it by going to our website, openownership.org, where it's now live. But even though this is just the baby, I think it's a pretty impressive baby. We have data for 1.9 million companies in 26 jurisdictions, and our sources are the UK Persons of Significant Control Register, the Slovakian Public Sector Partners Register, data from the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative, and also a couple of companies that have self-submitted their data, which has helped us bump up the jurisdiction count a little bit. So let's get started with the demo. So on my way here, we're here in Shoreditch in London, and I passed a place called Brewdog, which I'm sure many of you know is a company, a UK company that makes beer. So let's take a look at what information we have on them. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay, so first of all, we see in these search results that we will tell you how many of your results are legal entities. Not all of the results will be companies, some will be government structures and things like that. If there were any people by the name of Brewdog in the register, they would be showing here as well. And just to note that on the UK's PSC register, you actually can't search for people by name. So this is something that the Open Ownership is already adding. Okay, so let's see. Oh, and we also will show you which jurisdictions the data is in. So let's take a look at Brewdog's ownership data. So you can see here who controls Brewdog, as well as the companies that Brewdog controls. And we also see the means of control, which we're calling interests. So in this case, because of the underlying data, we are seeing ranges rather than specific percentages, but hopefully still useful. And also over here, we have some data from Open Corporates that has been linked just to give you a little bit more information when you're looking at the register. So I think I want to know a little bit more about this coffee company. So let's take a look at their records. And we've got two direct beneficial owners here, and our two friends who are beneficial owners of Brewdog, who own Third Wave Coffee Limited through Brewdog. And this is where you would see those relationships. So let's visualize this. So we have a little network graph here that shows the two people who own Third Wave Coffee through Brewdog, as well as the two direct owners and all of the ways that they control the company. And this tree view will give you a bit more of a sense of the structure of a corporate network. So now if I want a little bit more information about an ownership chain, which is the term that we have for everything from the company that you're interested in, the target company, all the way up to the beneficial owner of that company. I'll click here on details. And we have the same information about interests, but I want to draw your attention to this section here, which is showing you where we got all of the information about these relationships. And you will see a provenance for every piece of data on the register. So I wanted to start you off with a pretty simple example, but let's go to one that's a little bit more complicated, but also quite exciting, I think. Okay, so WASM is a company, a cement company from Togo. And I can find this out by clicking on Google here. But we actually won't match either jurisdictions or companies unless we're quite sure and we're quite confident about making that match. Now, we know about this company because it was listed in an EITI report. Unfortunately, in some of the EITI reports, there wasn't very much information to identify companies and jurisdictions. And so, there are some gaps like that here, but we make it very clear when you're looking at a gap, because we do think that the gaps are important information in themselves. So the EITI report listed a few companies here, and a few legal entities. So there's this holdings company registered in Panama that's quite interesting, the Togolese states, and 2 UK companies. So there's Quartz Limited and Kenelm Consulting. And now in the data, they actually did provide information that allowed us to link those 2 UK companies to data that was in the UK's PSC register. And so what we're seeing the register do right now is actually show connections that were not in the underlying data sets. So we know now that David William Powell and James Alfred Vigor are beneficial owners of WASM. We would not have known that from looking at the original EITI reports. And if we had searched for these beneficial owners in the UK's PSC register, we would not have seen their connection to this cement company in Togo. So that's really the concrete value that our register provides. It's the ability to see connections between people and companies that would be very, very difficult to see if you were working in siloed individual data sets. So we're really excited to provide that to everybody and add a lot more data to the register so that we can do that even better. So now let's take a look at what it looks like when your company's submitting data. So you would go here to the home page. And of course, start a new submission. Now I'm going to enter data that is absolutely 100% fake, but just for the sake of argument. The first thing we'll do is prompt you to search for your company. Again, it's really important that we can concretely identify companies and link them with the other information we have about that company. So that's why we would make you search for your company and see if it's already in the Open Corporates database. So let's say my company is this one, Blue Skies registered in Idaho, but I just want to show you quickly the form for creating a new company. It's really simple, it's really intuitive. There's some basic validation. So for instance, you're not allowed to enter an incorporation date that occurs in the future, which you wouldn't think is a problem, but actually we know from the UK PSC register data totally is. So just going back here, I'm going to select Blue Skies. And if I want to add a natural person, I would click here, or a legal entity that controls Blue Skies, I would click here on the plus. And I will quickly add myself as the beneficial owner of this company. I am not the true beneficial owner. Again, we see a really simple form, really clean, really intuitive, and we continue. So now you can either add additional intermediate entities between these 2 entities, or you can add a parallel entity. So say I own 50% of the shares and Maggie owns 50% of the shares. I could click here to the side of my name and add Maggie. The form will not allow you to proceed unless you add a natural person at the top of the ownership chain. And also unless you fill in this section here, which is your interests, so the actual means by which you control the company. Again, we see a very, very clean, very simple form, allows you to add exact percentages, which the UK PSC register does not have, as I've mentioned, and will also collect any other sorts of influence or control and allow you to specify that. So just really quickly, let's take a look at the record for a company that was actually one of our testers and has submitted data to the register. So I want to thank Periscope LLC and the other people who tested the register early, who submitted real data about their ownership, and I want to encourage other companies to get involved in that way. I think that's really important. And I hope that this gives you an idea of what this register can do and the amazing value that it's going to add to address the issues that Maggie and May spoke about. And I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rosia. So now that you've seen how what the platform looks like, we will start having a short discussion here, and I will open up for questions in a minute or two. And I will remind you again about the guidance that I gave at the beginning. So if you still have questions and you are watching us online, please submit those using the Twitter hashtag called OpenOwnership. And then we will select those and read them aloud here in the room. So I have an open question probably for you, but especially for Maggie and May, because you've been waiting for something like this data to be available for quite some time. So what do you think is possible with this data?
Well, really directly building from Zosha's example, I'm going to use another example which it describes exactly how we can prevent corruption from taking place. In Trinidad and Tobago, several years back, they were building the brand new airport. And they put out a tender, and only one company bid for it. We later find out that the whole thing was rigged, but only one bid came in. And a government official looked at that bid and thought, hey, this is way too much for what we were expecting. So they reopened the bid. What happened was the company that was involved with that first bid set up a couple of shell companies in order to hide their connections with the first bid and then place a second bid. That second bid was really high. So what happens was the government official said, oh, okay, well, we just hadn't done our sums correctly, we'll go with that first one. So immediately what happened as a result of that was the overall fraud that cost the Trinidadian and Tobagan people was over $100 million US. Now that's about 10% of the education budget in Trinidad and Tobago. If this had worked, if this had been in place back then, what we would have seen is that the connections between those companies, and crucially because the Trinidad and Tobago companies were also linked with shell companies through and linked up into the US. So it's two jurisdictions there involved. So even a national beneficial ownership register would have only contained some information, but linking it up with information in the US was going to make those much more useful. So it would have been useful for that government official to have a look at that data, for law enforcement, also for citizens that thought, hang on a sec, this airport seems to be costing us way too much. And so you get a bit more citizen accountability as well as all the journalists out there that would also be trawling through this data. We shouldn't really have to rely on leaks anymore. This data is kind of in the public interest and should be just much more available.
Right. Thank you. May, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would also say I think a lot of companies and investors currently have to go to enormous lengths to try and find this kind of information. They might have to have staff on the ground in different jurisdictions, go to a company office, submit a request, pay for it, etc., depending on the system. And even then, they aren't necessarily going to get beneficial ownership information. So for companies that are operating across multiple countries, the potential of this is that you have a place to go as a start where you can not only access more information that you need to assess your business relationships, but also that you can start to see the connections that cut across markets and across jurisdictions. And as I said earlier, I think business can also drive the usefulness of this. So I think for a company that's trying to manage a big and complex supply chain, this is one thing where you can very easily say to that big and complex supply chain, from here on in, we'd like to see that you're transparent about your ownership. And we understand that this isn't a requirement in all of your countries, but that it is a requirement for us. We could ask you for it privately, but if you put it up here publicly, that's going to be of more use to us and others. So we'd love to see not only small and medium enterprises like Periscope LLC who are stepping up and saying, we're proud to own this business and we're perfectly happy for people to know that we're behind it, but also for some of the larger players to actually use their market power, to save themselves from fraud and conflicts of interest and other problems, but also to help make markets more transparent and to help make them work.
Thank you. Jose, do you want to add?
I think that in addition to the data, what this tool offers is also the technology behind it. We are looking to integrate with national central registers, procurement systems, corporate due diligence systems, the way May was talking about. And this is technology that could help make those systems more efficient and also help avoid governments recreating the wheel. And I also want to point out that today is the launch of the beta beneficial ownership data standard, which is the first ever open data standard for beneficial ownership. And that is also going to be a tool for governments and anyone implementing EITI standards. And it will help solve some of those problems that we just saw with the WASM example, where perhaps there wasn't a good identifier for a company or a person, or there wasn't a great understanding of what a beneficial owner even is, and and how to represent that in data. And finally, in the data itself, I think Maggie's example shows that when this data is out in the open, it's much more likely that if you are trying to hide your identity, you're going to get caught. And that's even from people like businesses and government who are using the data on a daily basis as part of their jobs. You're much more likely to get caught if the data is out in the open. And I think we see from the Panama Papers that there is a cost to being caught lying about your identity in public. Another thing that the data will kind of show if we zoom out is where the gaps are and where the loopholes remain. And the more visibility we have on that, the more power we have to close those loopholes.
Thank you. Given all you just said, I'm wondering, do you think this is enough? Is this like a silver bullet, or what is needed next?
I can start with that one. If you think about it, we really, in 2017 now, with this kind of technology and with the amount of knowledge growing, but there are 235 jurisdictions in the world that that can provide the opportunity for you to establish a company, but only 58% of those have any form of online register. So, and that's only containing some basic information. So number one is obviously we need to move away from hidden closed-door paper registers. I mean, that's where there must be all kinds of great stories and great leaks if you could actually take those boxes of paper outside and share them. So, there's some investment needed to modernize our company registers, also our government procurement systems, moving to e-procurement to make it much quicker, faster online. But then also, even if you have all of these tools, we still need law enforcement to be using the data. It's still quite tricky to follow the trails. We know that people will still find ways to hide their identity, to throw their jurisdictions. We understand that those are the problems. We're trying to make it harder for people to be corrupt, and I think this is one step further. Finally, we need to strengthen some of the most basic reforms in countries, in all countries. We need to have a strong, independent judiciary that can actually support their law enforcement officers to actually go to the root of the problem and feel protected in doing their job. And if we have a country where the judiciary is corrupt or where law enforcement can easily be paid a bribe not to follow a case, then this won't have that much of an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see similarly that this is a really long-term process. This is about also in the private sector saying companies weren't invented to hide identity. They were invented to protect people as they innovated. But even back at the beginning of the creation of the kind of limited liability company, the actual dialogue back then was about we need to know about the fares of each other so that we can actually do business properly. So this is, for us also, and for me, business leaders, a kind of long-term change in terms of the norms about knowing who you're doing business with, being open and transparent. And then I think from our perspective, it is about having, over time, all governments act to collect and publish this information so that no matter where you're doing business, you can actually start to rely upon that information, you can start to feel more confident to participate in the enormous global public procurement market. You can have some greater trust grow in that market and hopefully some better results ultimately for citizens about how public money is used.
Thank you.
I think that there's a lot more work to be done, definitely. I think one of the things we definitely have to consider is the quality of the data that is being collected. I'll put in another plug for the beneficial ownership data standard, which we have worked on with over 20 international experts in this area, and will help solve a lot of problems and will make the data even more useful and linkable in a way that we have been discussing is so important. But of course, we need data, and the data needs to be global. And I think we collectively need to be putting pressure on the governments to fulfill commitments they've made to publish beneficial ownership information. Maggie has mentioned the Anti-Corruption Summit commitments. There's many more. The EU is considering it. Open government partnership countries, some of them have made commitments. There are lots of fora in which these commitments have been made, and I think now it's important for us to hold folks to those.
Okay, so you've been hearing about all of us, from all of us for slightly over half an hour, and I think it's about time for us to open the floor. So one of the main objectives of our event today is to hear from all your impressions and thoughts, questions you may have about the platform or the discussion we just had here. So this can be directed, of course, to a specific panelist or to the group as a whole. And as I was saying at the beginning, we are collecting questions from online from the Twitter feed, with the hashtag OpenOwnership. Of course, if you are in the room, feel free to ask any questions. So one of my colleagues, Kristen, will be reading those collected online out loud. So you won't see her on the screen, so but she's here reading the questions for us. So Kristen, any questions from the audience already?
Sure. I've got a couple from online, so we can start with those. The first question, this has come up from a few different people, is about quality assurance of the data submitted by companies. How do you make sure the data is correct, and how do you verify that the person entering the information is the actual owner or responsible person for that?
That's a really good question, and I think that's where the public aspect of the data is crucially important because, as I mentioned, there will be a lot of people using this data, procurement officers, due diligence officers, investigators, and it'll be, day-to-day use. And we know that as soon as you make data open, usage grows exponentially. And they're going to be the ones to spot discrepancies and things that are suspicious. These are people who have local expertise that a team of people we could hire here in London would never have. They have language expertise that we might never be able to assemble. So these are that's the way that we will verify the data, is really by putting it out into the open. Another aspect is having that data out there to reuse and compare with other data sets. If you are going to lie and hide your identity, it's very difficult to do so consistently. And I think finally we kind of want to focus on changing incentives and building the risk and the difficulty that is involved in hiding your identity. And so that's all part of our theory of change here.
I think I would also say that some of this is about the quality of the underlying data that's being collected, say, on a government register, and I see there we're seeing different models of enforcement for putting incorrect information onto a public register, and so I think we need to see more innovation also from government on this front of how to make sure that the information is high quality. I would say on the company side, I was talking to the head of compliance for a major global firm last week who was saying it's amazing in their department now because they're getting tweets and calls and emails that are actually identifying the corruption risks much faster than what their systems can do on their own. And so that's obviously part of, as Zosha said, part of the current reality, and this will hopefully speed that up and increase that. And then much like governments can really make sure that there is some teeth to these disclosure regimes, I think companies also have contractual measures that are open to them. So, they can say that contracts with suppliers may be made void if they've put false information out on ownership. I think there are many things that we can start to explore about how to tighten up the data and its quality.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just the last thing to say is to really hammer home this idea of sanctions for non-compliance. So the Global Register will take all the information that's already publicly available in other spaces and pull it into one place. But really, we need to make sure that when that information is disclosed, that there is some kind of sanction in place if you don't update that information, or if you. We need to make sure that people understand that this is a really serious and important issue, not just an unnecessary piece of bureaucracy. I think that's where we're moving as well. People are starting to understand that this information is actually really crucial.
So before we move to more online questions, anybody in the room who wants to make a question? There, Kristen? Behind you. Sorry.
Very quick question on what was just said. Does there seem to be an indication that there will be sanctions and fines or whatever if the information is that in the debate? Is that embedded really in the debate? Does that seem quite likely in the opinion of the panel that this will be enforced?
I believe the UK have some sanctions in place so that they will be. So the data in the UK register has only been online as of June. I think they've got about a year so that everyone can actually. So they've got a bit of a time lag before the sanctions will come into force, and I think that will be really crucial because that's when we'll see, companies trying to. Potentially they'll be making excuses, or they will actually have found it quite difficult. But interestingly enough, out of all of the cases, all of the companies that have already submitted their data, only 2% said that they were struggling to actually identify their beneficial owner. So previously we've heard a lot of suggestions that actually it's time consuming, it's difficult, it's going to add a lot of burden. But actually only 2% are saying that so far it's been too difficult for them to locate.
I think importantly in the UK, there's both penalties, but also they are investing in staff who are focused on enforcement. So I think this is one model that will be tested, but I think it is and it has to be part of the debate in other jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions, Kristen?
I'll take another one. I've got another one from Twitter here. A question from David Ross. How could there be a process to ensure the protection of whistleblowers? So I'm assuming he means referring to people that might use the data on the platform.
I can start with that, and I think that refers to what I was saying about this not being a silver bullet. There are so many other forms, so many other reforms, so much more that needs to be strengthened in individual jurisdictions. For example, we need to ensure that civil society, the organisations, that whistleblowers have the safety and security to be able to report on whether they find that there's inconsistencies or just in their general, lives and working in a business. They should have reporting channels so that they can translate up some of their concerns. And I don't think that is necessarily the function of this register, but this will be an additional tool where a whistleblower who might be wanting to raise a concern in a business might be able to use this to say, look, I'm not feeling comfortable about this. I have all of this other evidence, but look here, there's some other evidence that is kind of substantiating my concerns. But really it comes down to domestic legislation and also companies to be proactive and make sure that they have really good internal whistleblowing channels internally. It's good for them as well so that they can deal with those problems before they become public.
Exactly, and I think there's increasing awareness of that fact, that it's much better to have robust channels where you can spot problems. And just like that example I was giving before of the global compliance officer, I think companies are more and more seeing that actually their due diligence is strengthened by staff being able to raise issues, but also by other organisations raising issues. And certainly we've seen cases of companies that are investing a lot in trying to do due diligence in difficult contexts like Myanmar and being really unable to get to the bottom of it themselves and actually relying in a way on organisations that have some capacity to investigate and to raise concerns with them.
I think you guys have made great points. I would just add that down the line fairly soon, we are going to have capacity on the register for civil society organizations to
input data. And since every piece of data is connected to a provenance and everybody will know exactly where the data is coming from, users will be able to decide for themselves whether they want to trust that piece of data or whether they prefer something that comes from a regulatory source.
Thank you. Let's see if we can switch to a question here.
As Shia mentioned, a few OGP countries committed to open registers last year, and we're keen to see more doing so this year. We get a lot of pushback in terms of privacy, security concerns. What is a good, compelling value proposition for governments to really push on ambitious reforms to contribute to this global data set?
I think that there's a lot of value that Maggie and May have already touched on to having public open data. It's accessible to businesses that need it. It helps create a better business environment in the country. Maybe you can add to that in a moment. And it's going to help people in the government who are investigating financial crimes. And as I kind of mentioned, the data, open data, public data is also better quality data. The more people you have using the data, the more people you have spotting inconsistencies and errors. And I think in terms of the security issue, there's a lot that we can think about and try to be strategic about in approaching it on a jurisdiction to jurisdiction level. Often there are ways to deal with it in the data and deciding what information is presented to the public and what information is held back just for the exclusive use of law enforcement and relevant authorities. Things like home addresses, for instance, are not accessible on the UK's register, but the company's registered address is, so that's enough information to allow us to identify that company without posing a security risk. And often in a lot of jurisdictions, it's a lot of information about who owns companies is already out there in the public, either via the media or via shareholding reports and things like that. So we kind of have to remember that this isn't about the situations where the ownership is straightforward and obvious, where the shareholders are, the people who control the company. It's about the situations where somebody's trying to hide. And that's why we need, public data that's out in the open.
So, I think from a business perspective, the reason to go public and open data is because this information is crucial to business. If it's locked up behind a paywall or if it's in the hands of law enforcement but business can't access it, it's just inherently less useful for actually taking some of the risk, out of the market and out of business. So for us, that's kind of the crucial drive to make sure that this data is actually accessible and useful, and even more so when you're operating across jurisdictions. So the fact that there can be a common way that governments can structure the data so that it's more useful, so that I can easily compare across webs of ownership across jurisdiction, that is what's going to make it really significantly useful for business.
I think one crucial area is not to make blanket provisions that this type of people or this type of sector don't need to disclose, because what you'll find is you're creating a grey area where companies will suddenly pop up and that's suddenly the service that they provide. And so what the UK government has decided to do is take it on a case-by-case basis. So people can actually apply and say, you know what, for this and this and this reason, I do not want my information disclosed on this register. And it has to be a good reason. It can't just be that that for commercial purposes, for example. I'm not too sure that that's permitted. And again, I think the stats are really interesting. And I should tip off that it's DataKine and Global Witness that have done some really great work with other partners to really dig down into the data that's available already. And from the 1.3 million companies that have already put their information out there, only 30 have been granted the right to not disclose their beneficial ownership information. So obviously, the people conducting that assessment have decided that that's not good enough, whatever those reasons are not good enough for hiding the identity. So.
Thank you. Christine, next question.
Okay, so switching gears a little bit, we've got 2 questions from Twitter that are a bit more on the functionality of the platform, so I'll put them together. The first is, how can users download the data or use it through an API, and in which format, so CSV or JSON, et cetera? And the second one, is there any kind of button or function on the platform for flagging data that a user spots that might be out of date or incorrect?
Yeah, great questions. Downloading, we basically just, it's top priority for pretty much the next few days. You'll be able to download data from the register. And I believe it'll be available in JSON. So do take a look, and we can put something out on Twitter when the data is available to download, just so that you know. Right now our feedback mechanism is a Google form, but we are looking into other tools that we can implement on the platform that will allow you to flag in a record specifically when there's something wrong.
Thank you. Any question from the audience here at New Speak House? No? Okay.
I'll take another one from
Next
Twitter
one for you,
then.
Kristen.
So another question that's come up is the question of trying to come up with unique identifiers for government entities is always a challenge. So to what extent does open ownership tackle this and the public sector more generally?
Good question. I think that that's well addressed in the data standard, where we have considered all sorts of legal entities, you know, from the most basic to the most exotic, because of course, you know, the register and the standard needs to have the capacity to represent any kind of structure, and so I would encourage you to take a look at that, which we will also tweet out.
Any more questions from the live audience? Not yet. Just as a reminder, because I mentioned this twice or 3 times already, if you still have questions, please use the OpenOwnership hashtag on Twitter, so Michael and Kristen can read them aloud for the panel to respond to. No, okay. I have mine. It's still here, hidden, but I was waiting. So this all sounds very nice, but I'm pretty sure that there are some risks associated to one a project like this one. Can you envision some of those risks? And what are the ones that are you more maybe scared of?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, one of the big risks is that we'll see countries that have committed to implementing registers instead implementing half measures and you know, not going all the way to public and open. You know, using some of these arguments that have been coming up around security, perhaps, you know, the risk there is that we won't be able to provide that linking functionality on the register. We really need the data to do that. I mean, the wonderful thing is that we also have the capacity to allow companies to self-submit their own data. And so there are ways for us to kind of build movements even in jurisdictions where they do remain closed. But definitely it needs to be global. So we really need to take a hard look at all of those countries that have made commitments.
I agree, not enough data, and of course that we, you know, I think the concern that's always on everybody's mind is the data quality and data verification. And so I think just, you know, the biggest risk from my mind is can we, you know, deliver new and useful data that you know, people can have adequate confidence in. And I think that's going to be a process. And it's one of the things where we're going to need people who want that to be the case to help us keep pushing.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think we need as many jurisdictions to come on board as possible. The global register cannot replace national level reforms, so we really need national level governments to be publishing that data so that we can scrape it up to connect it, to make it useful. Obviously, when governments change, there's almost a honeymoon period where governments can say, you know what, this is my time, we are pro-transparency. And then the longer you leave it, the more they might realize that there are some connections that they might not want disclosed on a public register. So that's a political process, and it's something that I think as citizens, as journalists, we need to continually be pressurizing governments and future governments that are standing for office to say, and that this is the kind of levels of transparency that we want and expect. Another issue is whether people can or will use the data, and can we make sure that we can engage new generations of people that can use the data. I personally am not a very techie person. This is now probably one of the most easy tools for me, but I know that there's other people that will be really digging into the data, and we need to make sure that there's more people that can engage with this data and make it useful. A crucial question is, how do we make sure that the lawyers and the accountants that are often in the middle between some of these dodgy deals and the real estate agents and the luxury goods providers, how do we make sure they are using this? So we also have an outreach challenge for us as well. We need the real estate agents in London to be like, oh, hang on a sec, let me just check you out on open ownership. That's going to take a little bit of time, but until that happens, we just won't be making the progress that we need to see. But this is about changing norms, and in some ways this is really exciting because we are at the start of something. The people online, the people in this room are all part of this as well. So who knows? I'm quite excited personally to see what we will have achieved in 5 years.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point about having, an MVP, a little baby out there in the world, which the point really is to get your feedback and to get you to engage and to hear your thoughts. So it's great to be in this room and also getting a lot of your questions online.
And we've been really lucky to have a really engaged private sector advisory group, so companies from a number of jurisdictions and different sectors who've been really involved in saying this is what we need this to do for us. And part of what, for the baby that we have, proud of the fact that already it's giving companies and others access to information they didn't have before. So an ability to search the UK data by an individual's name, not just a company name, the ability to access information about extractive industries in a number of countries that was locked up, in PDFs until now. So I think as long as we keep kind of building the usefulness by actually unlocking new data, and they've looked at it and they've said, look, this is a hard thing to do, but actually the way, the baby is delivering already something that's going to be useful for companies.
So we are almost running out of time here. So, okay, so I will only have a last question for you because we only have like 3 more minutes. So what can we expect next, Sophia, from the platform? Because I know we have plans for the months ahead, and
yes.
And then May and Maggie, you can also respond. What would you expect next from your user case point of view, if you want?
The next steps are making this work for you. So we really encourage everyone watching and all of your friends to go and test the register and give us your feedback. We also have working groups that Maggie and May can tell you a little bit more about. And those are also a great vehicle for you to give us your feedback and to get a little bit more engaged in the register and the design, and tell us what would really serve your purposes as a user. And finally, in the next several months, we are going to be looking for governments and businesses to partner with. In terms of people who want to use this as a technical tool, integrating it with their national registers or their procurement systems or something like that. So if you're interested in partnering, please do reach out to us.
Yeah, so I think we're starting to see more and more business leaders and companies start to welcome this. Today there's a statement out in support of open ownership from a number of global business leaders, people like Oliver Bett from Allianz in Germany, Paul Polman, CEO of Unilever, François-Henri Pinault, who is the CEO of the Caring Group. So really starting to see across different jurisdictions and different sectors that people are saying, this is what we need, this is what we want. We welcome, many others to join their efforts to support this, and also to say to governments, we need this, but we can only have it if you do your part and collect the information. And then secondly, we have this private sector advisory group that's given input. We're very, very much welcome more companies to join us, to be involved in the testing process, to make this work for them. And lastly, join Periscope and the other companies who have, used this platform to say, I'm, proud of owning and running a company and doing my part in the economy. And I'd like to put my ownership in public and show you that I'm an ethical, transparent company who you can work with. So please submit your data.
And really, I think this is a really exciting example of how business and civil society and governments are actually teaming up to try to tackle a problem. So I think it shows that there are collaborations that we can't think in the old world of people being quite separate. It's much more, there's much more convergence. So from a civil society point of view, it would be great for people to be in contact with their networks, whether it's private sector or government, and try to encourage them or show them the benefits of using this. And if they're not, call them out. Hold them accountable. Say, why are you not willing to do this? Why do you not want to adopt a public register? Why do you not want to get your information out there? Because in the end, I think it comes down to trust. So there is also a civil society working group. The details are on the website as well. So drop us a line. We want to make this as useful as possible for people to advocate with and on their governments and people back in their home countries too.
Thank you. Okay, so we are now out of time. Thanks all of you for your participation today, for those of you here in person and those of you online, for all the questions that you put to this amazing panel of three fantastic experts today. And thanks to New Speak House for hosting this session today. Finally, I want to remind you that we are live on Twitter, on OpenOwnership, openownership.org, and if you're interested, you can follow us or you can subscribe to our newsletter at any time to keep yourself updated with the latest on the project. So thanks everybody, and we're wrapping up here. Thank you.